All right. Thank you so much. Welcome to another episode of the Love, Hope, Lyme podcast. My name is Fred Diamond. I'm the author of Love, Hope, Lyme, what family members, partners, and friends who have a chronic Lyme survivor need to know. Of course, I'm also the host of this podcast. Lindsay, the book, Love, Hope, Lyme is available on Amazon. If people would like a signed copy, they could reach out to me via Facebook or LinkedIn. And Lindsay, as you probably know, I've made the e-version, the PDF of the book, free for Lyme survivors from day one. I have distributed over 1,000 copies. If you're a Lyme survivor and you would like the e-version of the book, please feel free to reach out. Of course, you're listening to this podcast or you're watching on YouTube. If you are listening on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, or if you're listening to this as a podcast, go to Apple Podcasts, give me a 5-star review. I would greatly appreciate it. And if you're watching this on YouTube, feel free to give a comment as well. So I'm very excited about today's show. We're doing the interview in November of 2023, and I have Lindsay Keys, who is the co-director of the fascinating film, The Quiet Epidemic. And the reason that we're talking to Lindsay today is for two reasons. One is we want to talk about the film. I've seen the film, Lindsay, 4 times. I have signed my book at 3 different book signings, including your big one in Glens Falls, New York. And I've signed books in Wilmington, Delaware with our mutual friend, the great Greg Kirk. And I also signed books in Frederick, Maryland with Dr. Nancy Fox and her team when the film first came out. And I actually watched it back in November of 2022 when it first came out, pre-stream. And I learned something new every single time. First, I want to applaud you on the film, and we're going to talk in detail about what you're doing with the film now and get into some of the specifics. But the reason we're talking today is because the CDC, who you talk about in depth on the film, and the film, The Quiet Epidemic, gives a lot of the history of some of the politics related to Lyme disease, which is absolutely insane. Every time you watch the film, you're just mesmerized that a disease has politics associated with it. And you live that, and we're going to talk deep about it. But the CDC, one day, when exactly did the CDC post their new webpage? Do you recall when that was?
I was wondering about that. I know that I think LymeDisease.org was the first to post about it, and that was October 27th.
Okay.
I don't know if it happened just before that or on that day, but they're pretty on top of things. So I trust that it was around that time.
So what happened was there was a page posted on the CDC website that basically was titled "Chronic Symptoms Following Infections," and I'm going to read this out so that people can hear it. But also, we'll place a link on the podcast show notes and on the YouTube page. But it says infections can sometimes leave people with symptoms that last for weeks to months or longer, even after appropriate treatment. Some of these symptoms are well recognized and specific to the type of infection. For example, loss of smell from COVID-19. Other symptoms are unexplained and general. For example, fatigue or difficulty thinking, which we refer to in a lot of cases as brain fog. Similar symptoms can follow many different types of infections. These general symptoms can include tiredness or fatigue that interferes with daily life, flu-like symptoms, including muscle pain, headache, sweating, symptoms that get worse after physical or mental effort, known also as post-exertion malaise, difficulty thinking or concentrating, sometimes referred to as brain fog, trouble finding words, chronic or recurrent joint pain, sleep problems. Now, the big kicker for us today, it says some disease agents have been linked to chronic symptoms, Borrelia burgdorferi. How do you pronounce that? Say that again.
I think that's right. Borrelia
All right.
burgdorferi. Yeah,
All
you
right.
did a
That's
good job.
that's the
You're a
bacteria.
pro.
I always think of it as Lyme disease. And of course, it's named after
Yeah.
one of the doctor originally found the strain, but the bacteria which causes Lyme disease. Okay. So all of a sudden, the Lyme community was aflutter about what does this mean? Is our insurance company is going to start covering this? Is a cure for Lyme disease? Will a vaccine come out? So many questions. People were posting that this is the best day in the history of chronic Lyme, and other people were posting this doesn't mean anything. In the film, The Quiet Epidemic, you do such an amazing job once again talking about the history and the research that you did. And we'll talk a little more about the film. It's just unbelievable about how you got to this unbelievable story about how a government agency, right? The CDC, as a matter of fact, I went to college in Atlanta at Emory University, which is just across the street from the Centers for Disease Control. And we've actually, when I was the editor in chief of the newspaper, we actually did stories, positive stories on the CDC, but the CDC is vilified by people in the Lyme community. All right, before we get to the film, two questions. Why is the CDC thought of so unfavorably by the Lyme community? And then secondly, what does this announcement mean from your perspective?
Yeah. So I think the CDC is thought of unfavorably by the Lyme community because it's been almost 50 years since Lyme disease was first discovered. It was discovered in 1975. That's before I was even born, for some context. And I think everybody wants progress to happen quickly, especially those who are suffering, right? And you would imagine that if a lot of people are sick, there are researchers in the early years discovering that Lyme disease is really complicated, that it's potentially life-altering, potentially deadly, that a lot of emphasis and research funding would be prioritized for Lyme disease, but that just has not been the case. And so I think beyond just CDC, there's a lot of frustration with the NIH as well. But a lot of people are looking to the CDC to be the one saying, hey, this is a big problem and we need to figure this out. And it appears that that used to be the case more so in the early years. And then it kind of became this story of, oh, Lyme disease is being blown out of proportion. And what's worse than Lyme disease is anxiety about Lyme disease. There was actually an article about that at one point. So I think that it's very, I would say, suspicious for a lot of people who do know the history and who do know the science to see the CDC be so quiet about this, and yet to see the CDC be so loud about other infections like Zika virus or West Nile virus that impacts a small fraction of the number of people who are impacted by Lyme. And we have this stat in the Quiet Epidemic, and you see the graphic come up on the screen. It's very sobering that there are more cases of Lyme each year than breast cancer and HIV combined, right? And that's not to say that we shouldn't be prioritizing funding for breast cancer and HIV. Of course we should, but why do people not know that the Lyme disease test is not always accurate, that the treatment is not always effective, and that if you go to a doctor's office, in many cases, they don't even want to talk about Lyme disease, let alone diagnose you and treat you. And so there's a lot of frustration with the CDC. They're at the helm of the ship. And we as taxpayers, as the public that is vulnerable to all sorts of issues, you want to believe that your health agencies are looking out for you and that they're listening to you. And it just, in recent years, it appears to be perhaps more openness at the CDC, which is great. But there's been a lot of trust broken after, nearly half a century of that not being the case. And there are a lot of questions that the Lyme community has. And I think people just want to know that they're being heard. And the way to rebuild that trust is to have a respectful, open conversation where the patient population, the Lyme disease foundations, who are very high-powered, brilliant foundations, the researchers, the Lyme treating physicians, these aren't just small fries out there, yelling on their street corner about some strange phenomenon. I mean, this is like, it's entered the mainstream. It's so big at this point. It is in the mainstream. And I think the CDC really at this point, hopefully they have no choice but to come around eventually, hopefully sooner than later.
So just curious. So did the CDC reach out to you after the film came out?
Yeah, they did.
What do they say?
Well, actually, let me think about this for a second. We had a back and forth. We reached out. I think we actually reached out to them first, because we wanted to have a screening at the CDC. We thought, why not? We have nothing to hide. Hopefully they have nothing to hide, right? Why not just have hard conversations in a public forum? We wanted to bring together some people from the Lyme disease community, leading Lyme advocates, and some scientists and doctors, and have, a dialogue about this. And it quickly became clear that that was not going to happen. And then they responded that they were basically upset that we didn't ask them for comment in the film. Instead, what we did was we used archival footage of one of their officials who's been a spokesperson for them for a long time. And essentially what this person at the CDC said to us was, if you had asked us for comment, we would have said, and they gave their statement. And it's like, well, that's basically what this person says in the archival footage in the film. And that statement doesn't really add to the conversation. It just kind of feels like we've been in this whirlpool for decades. And I don't know why, because there is so much science that we can talk about more, but there's so much science. I don't know why anyone's pretending that. In my opinion, it seems like some people are pretending that, we just don't know. And it's like, if it's been 50 years and you don't know, then let's again prioritize funding these questions and the right researchers to ask those questions and figure it out, rather than just creating this air of like mystery as if it's just too hard to figure out. It's not, and Neil used to say that to us all the time. He was like, we can figure this out. We just need the resources and we need the backing of our public health agencies. And if we get those things, then we can figure this out. And so it is mysterious to me in the sense that it just seems like there hasn't been a priority in the way that you and I know, and so many people know, that it really needs to be.
So a couple questions. I have a ton of questions for you. Again, I've watched the film 4 times. You feature some people in the film I want to talk about. Dr. Rich Horowitz, who wrote the foreword to my book, Love, Hope, Lyme, and he's a major factor there. You just alluded to Neil, and of course, you're talking about Dr. Neil Specter of blessed memory, and talk about him for a little bit. There's so many people. When I wrote my book, Love, Hope, Lyme, I started researching Lyme a year before the book came out. In the summer of 2021, I had someone in my life who was a chronic Lyme survivor that I wanted to know more about what this person was going through. I didn't know anything. All I knew was gluten-free pizza is something that is important to people with Lyme disease. And then I started getting deep into it. I read every book, of course. People reach out to me, which is insane, all over the world, asking questions. And the book has become popular in a lot of regards. But a lot of people who've been in the Lyme community for years are very fond about Dr. Specter. Talk about him for a little bit and his impact on you and his role in the film.
Yeah, I'm going to try not to get emotional. Sometimes I do, but I'm really going to try not to. It's good practice to sometimes just, not go all the way into the emotions and the sadness, because there's a lot of that. I think it's Winslow, my co-director, and I, we've done so many interviews and we've spoken on so many panels, and sometimes we speak in a way that feels like a little bit light or something, but there's a whole heap of grief beneath that. And, we have to sometimes like protect ourselves from that, because otherwise we would just be crying all the time. But I think it's important to note that sometimes like we can have these more like intellectual conversations and they're so important, but behind that for each of us is like this really, for many of us, a deep personal story that's, so emotional. And I never want that to be like forgotten, right? And you and I both know that, but I just want to like state that very clearly for the viewers. Like, here I am just like, smiling and talking about this really hard thing, but that's sometimes what we have to do just to get through Neil was one of the most special people that I met my entire life. And I know a lot of people feel that way. He made everyone feel like he was their best friend. He was so good at making people feel seen and heard and deeply cared for. And he was not afraid to stand up for what he believed was right, and which in this case is also backed by science, which is great, which is what we've been saying, right? The Lyme disease test does not always work. He learned that in a very painful way. He went undiagnosed for so many years that eventually he had to have a heart transplant because the Lyme infection went to his heart. And also the treatment doesn't always work. And that's the case for people who are treated acutely early on in the disease, and for people who have been infected for, weeks, months, years, decades, which seems more obvious, right? That would be the case. So Neil was willing to go to bat for this community that had been so disparaged and pushed to the fringes and told that they were crazy and they were malingerers and it was all in their head. And here he is, this Harvard trained physician scientist who works at Duke University. He had developed 2 FDA approved cancer drugs. He was, as he said, he fell through the cracks of the system, and he was the system, right? So you can imagine then how hard it is for someone in my hometown in rural upstate New York, this little farm town, who maybe, doesn't know the medical lingo and doesn't understand biology to go get a diagnosis. So Neil was speaking for all of these people. And it was such a blessing to be able to spend that time with him and filming his story, and especially during such an exciting moment for him where he had galvanized this team of researchers at Duke University, Tim Haysted and his lab. They're still going. They just published a very important paper, an update, where it appears that they're making progress on developing a different kind of therapeutic for Lyme. Neil, because he was so lovely and he was so brilliant, his colleagues took him seriously. And I think that was one of his superpowers, was going into the medical community and just saying, look, this could happen to you. I didn't think that this was going to happen to me. This could happen to you too. And so you should pay attention to what I have to say. And I'm so glad that through the Quiet Epidemic, his story and his voice still is getting out there and spreading that message. And we would have never imagined that we would be filming him at the end of his life. And I miss him. I miss him a lot. But I told you before we started recording, we're going to North Carolina just next week on Tuesday. I think it's the 14th. Is that what it is?
It is, yes.
Okay, so I don't know when this will be released, but I think maybe the day before. But we will be in North Carolina with Neil's wife Denise and some members of the local community who are working on Lyme disease research, and so his legacy lives on.
Yeah, he's again, I've watched the film 4 times, and when you watch a film like, well, specifically yours, you get angry, you get sad. I didn't know Dr. Specter, but there's tears in the film. There's disgust, not with the film, but with the way certain doctors just talk, now that we know what we know. So I want to talk to you about this film as a filmmaker. When you do a documentary, it's not scripted, so you may have an idea what you want to do. I'm just kind of curious. I mean, you filmed things over, of course you went into the archives, but you also filmed Dr. Specter over a period of years, and Julia, who was featured in the film, over a couple of years. When you started, tell us why you and your co-director Winslow, why you did the film, but also what did you expect? And did what you finally produce, was it completely different? Was it pretty much the same? Did you take it where you wanted to? Give us a little bit of an insight as a filmmaker. And first question is, again, why did you create the film? And then answer the question about, did it go in the direction you expected? And if not, what happened along the way?
Yeah. Okay. So first, I think, the first question is, why did you create the film? And then answer the question about, did it go in the direction you expected? And if not, what happened along the way? Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So first, I always say that the film chose us because Winslow and he was, I think, maybe 23, 24, and I was 26. So we were young. We both were so sick. We did not know what was going on. We both ended up moving back home with our parents in upstate New York. It was really bad. I mean, it was really, really bad. Trigger warning, Lyme symptom description. It's that scary. I felt like I was being electrocuted all day, every day. I was losing my short-term memory. I couldn't remember how to get home from work, and I was living in New York City. So I would go to the subway, and I was not only forgetting where I lived, but I started to forget who I even was. And so it was severe emotional, psychological, physical pain, and then financial pain of then having to go outside the medical system, the traditional medical system, and seek care that not only did I not know if it was going to work, but maybe it was going to be for a lifetime. And it was very expensive. So I wound up at home with my mom in upstate New York. She also was going through Lyme at the time. And if not for her, I never would have known. I would not be here talking to you, Fred, if not for my mom going through the hell that she went through to ultimately get the diagnosis and the treatment that she received. And she got her tip off from her friend, right? So people joke that it's like a word of mouth diagnosis. It's sad, but it's true, And so I ended up with my mom. She told me I had to go see a Lyme specialist. I was kind of skeptical. I was like, what? I thought that she had been hoodwinked by, I was like, someone's fooled my mom into thinking she has this disease that doesn't exist. Like, I was a total skeptic, even though I had had Lyme and I was treated for it. I thought I was cured. She kept telling me, Lindsay, you're not cured. You're not cured. You're not cured. So eventually I had no choice but to listen to her, because it was like life or death. I was like, no one else is giving me any other option. And so it's time for me to listen to my mom. I wound up reluctantly going to this specialist, and the nurse practitioner, Jen Mager, she's got Jen Goldstock now. She was at the Glens Falls screening where we met.
Yeah.
He said, how are you going to get through this, at my first appointment? Because I also had compulsive suicidal ideation, and I don't have that anymore. I just want to make that clear. If I ever end up in a strange situation, I do not want to kill myself. I'm never going to kill myself. I just want to get that on the record. So that's not that's not a thing anymore for me, thank goodness. But she said we find that our patients who have a purpose tend to have better outcomes. And at that point, I had been thinking about making a film for years about Lyme disease, couldn't find anyone to do it with me. But I saw no other option. So I said, I'm going to make a film about Lyme, kind of like no matter what. And she said, oh, we have another patient here who's your age, and he's a filmmaker with Lyme. Do you want me to connect the two of you? I still can't believe it. I'll never forget that moment. It was like, I knew that my life was about to change. And I didn't know how, but I knew it was going to change. And that was 8 years ago. And so I wrote a note to my co-director, and she handed it to him the next day. We had no idea where this was going to lead. We had no funding. Our health was our bodies and our minds were completely failing us. I'm sleeping on my mom's couch. Eventually he started sleeping on my mom's couch. We turned her house into our little production office. She was feeding us, and we were just it was an obsession. I just became obsessed. I was like, how many people are going through this? We need to figure this, we need to do something about this. I was so, like you said, I was angry, and I was also very confused, and I wanted to understand. So that's really how it started. And we started filming, pretty close to home, because we couldn't even afford plane tickets. We had no funding. And we just started to, we talked to Holly Ahern at Lyme Action Network, and she would kind of give us some suggestions. You should talk to this person. You should talk to this person. And so we were on a trail, an investigative trail, suddenly, without even knowing that there was anything to investigate. And it just built and built and built. from there. And then we ended up filming for 4.5, 5 years, and traveled all across the US. We went overseas. It became so much bigger than we could ever put in a single feature documentary. And I think that was the hardest part. I think a lot of people in the Lyme community, everyone has their personal passion based on their lived experience, whether as a patient, a scientist, a doctor. Everyone has a belief about, it's about this, or you have to talk about this. And I had my own convictions, and so did Winslow, things that we desperately wanted to feature, that when it came down to editing the film, we had 700 hours of footage that we had to cut into an hour and 40 minutes. And so you can imagine, right, how much information is just living on our hard drives right now. And we hope to, funding permitted, someday be able to cut shorter form content for social media. We have so many expert interviews and so much incredible footage. We're also following so many, people in the way that we followed Neil and Julia. Incredible people opened their lives up to us. That was another really hard part, was, not because their stories didn't matter or they weren't beautiful or important. It was just that there simply wasn't time. And it came down to, how can we fit this information together in a way that is based on the facts, is emotional, but also measured in a way that can reach skeptics even in the medical community, which we are doing. And so I joke that it's the hardest thing I'll ever do. And I don't know where my life leads, so it might not be, but I really can't imagine anything more difficult than making a film about the illness that you're certain is killing you, without a safety net of any kind. We just took a huge leap.
Yeah, it's kind of incredible as you talk about this. And now I'm rethinking, like you mentioned, you traveled overseas. Of course, you went to India, to film when Julia went there for some of her treatment. And there were so many interesting angles. You talked about why there's not a vaccine. You talked about why testing is such a challenge. We saw Julia, who's one of the featured people in the film, progress. You talked about the politics. You went deep into history about why this happened. One of the best things about the film as well is, in the very beginning, you showed birds with ticks. When people say, well, I've heard this, I interviewed Nicole Malachowski for my podcast, a jet pilot with the Air Force. She believed she was bitten in North Carolina, and the doctor said, we don't have Lyme in North Carolina. But you showed very clearly in the very beginning ticks on birds all over the country. And as we know now, of course, Lyme disease is all over the place. So how's the film doing? So the film came out. How's the film doing? I'm also curious, what else have you learned since the film came out? Has there been, you really, like you just mentioned, you had 700 hours of filming, and it was a pretty dense hour and a half or however long the film was. When as a film, it's like you're watching this film and you're like, and then you go into another place, it's like, oh my God, as we always use the analogy here of broken ankles. There are no Facebook groups for broken ankles, yet there's 1,000 Facebook groups. Okay. And there's close to 1,000 Instagram posts per day. And there's 50 conversations on Reddit about Lyme. There's 0.0 about broken ankles. So as you watch the film, it's like, oh, there's another angle. And then there's the other angle. And then there's this angle. What have you learned since the film came out, and then how's the film doing?
Yeah, the film's doing well. I should say quickly that a lot of people were asking us why, some people in the community were upset with us. I'll just be clear. Why isn't the film on Netflix? Like, as if that was our decision. Of course, we wanted the film to reach as many people as possible. That's why we made it. But a lot of the networks, I can't name any of them, but a lot of the networks, we had, private conversations with them, members of our team, and they were nervous about putting their names behind and their, energy behind a story that's so controversial. I think it's really important to just state that clearly, because I remember when I was first sick, I was trying to convince someone in my life who didn't believe me that this was real and it was serious. And he said, if this was as big as you say it is, people would be marching in the streets. And it's like, no, no, no. There's a reason we call the film The Quiet Epidemic. And that's because a lot of the mainstream media has shied away from this story for whatever reason. I think in part because, you know, certain media outlets are funded by interests that have, you know, a stake in the current definition and approach for Lyme disease. And also because it's a really long, complicated story. And
Yes.
you can't just boil it down into a 30-second or even a 5-minute bite that's going to get the whole story across, right? And so there's that part, but also people aren't marching in the streets because they're sick. And unlike HIV AIDS, which was an amazing movement, and let's not forget, there is some historical precedence for what we're experiencing here with an epidemic that's raging, that was being ignored by the government. I think some people take for granted that HIV is something that we just speak about so openly now, and we know it's so serious. The HIV AIDS community had healthy advocates in the streets fighting for them. But because Lyme is this invisible, often invisible illness, we don't have that kind of support. So yeah, the film, getting the film out into the world has fallen squarely on our little team. And our producer, Chris Hedges, who's a legend, she's amazing. I'm so glad that she believed in us and got behind us because people really respect her. She has a long history of making documentary films. She's currently the governor of the documentary branch of the Academy right now, one of the governors. And, you know, she's very well respected. And the fact that she lended her credibility to our film and cause is huge. And I will be forever grateful for her for that. But she calls us the little engine that could. And that's what we are. That's what we've always been. So that said, you know, the film is doing very well considering it's our little engine that could. And the Lyme disease community, people like yourself, Fred, every person that has rented the film, that has gone to a screening, that has made a post, it really makes a difference. It really does. And so at this point, you know, we had a very successful film festival circuit. We were in more than 20 film festivals, some of them very credible, you know, some of the best film festivals out there. That was an amazing opportunity to see our film in front of audiences that were not the Lyme disease community. And I'm so glad that we had that experience because we always wanted this film to reach broader audiences. The Lyme community is learning from our film as well, but most of the Lyme community knows most of what's in the film, right? We want to reach people who know nothing about what's going on, you know, whether it's a parent whose child has this, you know, unnamed autoimmune condition and they can't get to the bottom of it, but they had tick bites 10 years ago, or, you know, a scientist who, you know, is looking to make a real impact in a field that's lagging, or, you know, a doctor who maybe lives in an endemic area and thinks that you have to have a positive Western blot to have Lyme disease. We want to reach, you know, it's a universally relevant story. And
Absolutely.
I wish that weren't the case. But
No,
it is.
it's definitely true. When you learn about the disease, um, I sometimes I'll post, this is a ridiculous disease that no human being should have to endure. It really is. I mean, you've described a little bit about what you've gone through, and I've met thousands of people in the short time that I decided to learn more about this, and it's no human being should endure some of these things. And like you said, also, it's very complicated. You know, it's very, very challenging to treat. Now, hopefully, if you catch it like right away, you know, it's going to be painful, but you should be able to, with early treatment, it's a good thing. But once it gets into the chronic stage, it goes so many different places based on your you know, your whole, your body, and, you know, in some cases your ancestry, you know, geographically, your just so many things. And you do a great job explaining that. Again, we're talking today with Lindsay Keys. She's the co-director of the Quiet Epidemic. I want to ask you one final question here. Um, so what do you want people to do? What do you recommend? I know, this isn't just a film that you made and you put it up on the shelf and you can watch it. You told me before it's part of an impact campaign. So what do you want people to do? What do you recommend? And what are you guys doing now? What's next?
Yeah. So, ooh, there's so much to do. I think talking about it is really important. I think talking about it in a way that brings people into the fold is really important. There's a lot of anger, there's a lot of sadness. I was there once, I totally get it. But I think, educating the people in your life really matters. I think that beyond that, for our impact campaign, what we're hoping is that we can just continue to build our following. And then when moments like this happens, like with the CDC update, for example, and I don't know if you still want to talk about that, but I have a lot of thoughts about that. We can kind of, develop a sort of united front. I think the Lyme disease community has been very fragmented for many years. There are a lot of politics even within the Lyme disease community. I think that if we could unite, we could make a real impact. And so that's part of why we made the film, is to bring a lot of the Lyme disease organizations under the same tent, to issue statements like the one that we were about to issue on regarding the CDC, keep the conversation alive. Hopefully, teams like ours can help hold the CDC accountable in some ways, even if it's just reaching out for comment and with questions. They're supposed to be in service of the public. We are the public. We're also independent journalists. I think that a lot of Lyme disease organizations, understandably so, have to be very careful about their relationships with organizations like the CDC. I get it, but we're not funding science ourselves. And so we have a bit more freedom to press and push and ask some of these hard questions. And on behalf of our team, but also our followers and audiences of the Quiet Epidemic. So, one of our big goals right now is we're working with this congressional impact strategist. Her name's Bonnie Abanza. She's incredible. She has brought many films to Congress. She's gotten legislation passed. She believes that the Quiet Epidemic could move the needle on this issue, which is why she's, agreed to work with us. We are going to be calling for a congressional hearing on Lyme disease. So that's our biggest ask. We have a lot of asks. We want insurance coverage. We want more funding for science. We want people to, we want this disease to just be acknowledged widely, in the way that a disease of this scale should be acknowledged widely. But I think, a lot of these steps are sort of incremental, and it could take another 50 years for us to achieve some of these things. So I think that with the film's message being what it is, with the evidence that we lay out in the film, one of our most powerful asks can be and should be, we need to have a congressional hearing on the state of Lyme disease. So the last one was in 1993. It was hosted by Senator Ted Kennedy. It's called Lyme Disease, a Diagnostic and Treatment Dilemma. And if you read those transcripts, you can find them online. Maybe you could actually link to them in the show notes, Fred. I can send you the link. If you read the transcripts, all of these people were brought together from both sides of the aisle in Lyme disease, the federal agencies, and they just got to say their piece so that it was on the public record, all of it in one place. And I think that we need to do that again, because if you read that transcript, it's like, yes, behind the scenes, things are changing. There's more funding for science than ever before. That's amazing. Center for Lyme Action is doing incredible work. Organizations like the Stephen and Alexandra Cohen Foundation, Bay Area Lyme, Project Lyme, Global Lyme. I mean, it's never ending. They're funding the science. We're getting the evidence. It's amazing. All of this is so good. But I'm not going to say because it's a scary thought. If someone were to be bitten by a tick and go to the doctor's office, what happens? Yeah. They're given the test. Maybe it's positive. Maybe it's negative. Maybe they get treated. Maybe they don't. Even for the lucky ones who do, they may not get better. And then what? They end up in the Wild West like the rest of us, right? So I think we need to go to the root. I think we need to start having these hard conversations. We need to get real honest. We need to stop tiptoeing around, how we got to this point. Why is this so controversial? The science is there. And I think if we air all of that out, it's imperative that Congress exercise their oversight and ensuring that our CDC, our public health agencies are acting to benefit the patients. And I don't know who's been calling the shots so far. We have some suspicions based on, evidence that we show in the film, but I would say it's fairly clear at this point that it's not patient driven, and we need to change that. And if it isn't going to come from within the CDC, then it needs to come from outside of the CDC, and we need to bring everyone together to have that conversation.
All right. So in wrapping up here, first of all, is there anything else you want to say about the CDC announcement that we might not have covered?
I think so.
Yeah.
Yeah. What I would love to say is I was very excited when I started to see all of these graphics come up on my social media. CDC now recognizes chronic Lyme. I was like, wait, what? But then I read their website. And I don't want to deflate all of the hope, because I think, hopefully it is a step in the right direction. I don't know what's coming down the pipeline for this agency. I don't know. But post-treatment Lyme disease syndrome, PTLDS, has been acknowledged for years, right? And we have a CDC official saying it in the film itself. We know people are suffering. We care about them. This isn't verbatim, but we don't know, essentially, we don't know what's causing these symptoms. Right. And so I think we need to be careful as a community to not jump the gun and say, oh, great. Okay. Like we've made it. It's all good. Where's the insurance coverage now? Because saying that Lyme disease can lead to chronic symptoms is essentially what PTLDS has meant for a very long time. Yeah. You get an infection, you're still symptomatic. We don't know what causes it. And in many cases, you don't need further treatment. Whereas the Lyme disease community has been saying, yes, okay, maybe there's a post-infectious syndrome, but we also know, because of really credible science from highly credible researchers, that the Lyme disease bacteria in some cases also persists. And those patients, like Vicki Logan, who we show in our film, have been shown to benefit from additional antibiotic therapy. And so for us as a team, while it's great to see Lyme disease listed amongst all of these other illnesses that can lead to chronic symptoms, something that the LymeDisease.org article posted or highlighted, which we also want to flag, is, they say infections can sometimes leave people with symptoms that last for weeks to months to longer, even after appropriate treatment. And I think that one line right there, even after appropriate treatment, we have to be so careful about that. Yeah. We can't let that slip under the radar here. That suggests that someone is cured, they've received appropriate treatment, and we don't know why they're still sick, right?
Lindsay, one of the things that always has struck me with this whole situation is exactly what you just said. I've spoken to so many people, including some that were near to me, that were bitten and were not diagnosed with Lyme for decades, right? So they weren't properly treated. And if they were, quote unquote, CDC treated, it was 20, 30 years. People who, even Dr. Horowitz, when he was on my podcast, he said that there was someone who spoke to 100 doctors before they got to him and he was able to diagnose. That, of course, is an extreme case, but I've heard people who've been with 10, 15, 20 doctors, the usual thing. And then by the 20th doctor, they say, we've tested for everything. It's probably in your head. You've heard that many, many times. But let's say even if on the 20th or 10th time, the doctor says, hey, you have Lyme. Well, it's well past, the 3 or 4 weeks that, you may have been able to take care of it. That's always kind of mesmerized me, is that, okay, then maybe you do 4 weeks of antibiotics, but it's too late because the bacteria, and then of course, all the co-infections as well.
That's huge.
The parasites.
The co-infections, right? That's huge.
Yeah.
I mean, there's never been a treatment trial for people with overlapping tick-borne infections. And so isn't it fair to say that, to ask, are these people who are not responding to treatment
Yes.
Is the bacteria persisting?
Yes.
Do they maybe have a Bartonella infection or a Babesia?
Yes.
And I mean, it's, like we could name 20 different infections, and
Right.
that's why they're still sick, rather than saying, we don't know, it's a mystery. And here's your steroid or your antidepressant or your painkiller or all of the above. And you just need to live with, the IDSA guidelines referred to these
Yes.
as the aches and pains of daily living.
Yes.
We know that these are not the aches and pains of daily living. These are children who are missing out on their childhoods. These are, people whose families are falling apart, people who are taking their own lives. This is
Yes.
not the aches. I never thought that I would dedicate 8 years of my life to a film like this. I had other plans,
Yes.
and I'm so happy to do the work. I do believe that, this was a part of my calling, as painful as it is, but these are aches and pains of daily living don't drive people to do the things that we're talking about, right? So this is really serious stuff. And rather than saying we don't know what causes it, it must be something else, I think we need to acknowledge that it's probably all of the above. And ultimately, patients should have options for care, not just the IDSA guidelines, but they're the ILADS guidelines, right?
Yes.
If something isn't working, let's try something else. And doctors should be able to exercise their clinical judgment in doing that as well. Okay, this treatment didn't work, let's try another one. And ideally, all of it, of course, is covered by insurance, because no one should go bankrupt because they were bitten by a tick.
Absolutely. I mean, as I concluded my book, you have this person in your life, and all these things happen just because they were bitten by a tick
Yeah.
years ago, decades ago, whatever it might be. Lindsay Keys, I just want to acknowledge you and of course your partner in the team,
Yeah.
for the work that you're doing now, of course, but it's such a, and I don't want to say this the wrong way, but it's such a noble thing that y'all have done. Uh, Again, I've watched the film 4 times. I've seen people comment on the film. First of all, it is a beautifully done film from a movie perspective. Good for you. It's well done. The cinematography is fantastic. The story progression is excellent. From a just pure documentary film perspective, it's extremely well done. So good for you on that. But the continued work that you're doing, this is people ask me, why am I doing the podcast? I say, I'm trying to bring some peace to a community that needs it. Right. It is such an ill-informed, people are ill-informed about it. Even people who have it are still ill-informed. I discovered recently that Reddit has a big Lyme grouping, and I'll see people ask, people who have quote unquote chronic Lyme who are asking basic questions. Why is gluten a bad thing? Well, there's all these things that are out there, but they're all people are trying to discover. They don't know. It takes time to understand why things have affected them. And most people don't know because, like you said before, it's a hidden type of an illness, or whatever the word is, where you don't look sick, as people say. I once said to a chronic Lyme patient, I said, hope you have a great weekend. And she said, I'm going to have a horrible weekend. I know exactly what my weekend is going to be. And she said, when you talk to someone with a chronic illness, don't say something like that. Now, this might have been an isolated case,
Yeah.
but anyway, I just want to acknowledge what you've created, that is obviously making an impact. We're going to get, do you feel comfortable or confident that we're going to have congressional hearing at some point in
No,
the near
I mean,
future?
I hope so. You know, I think that if I were in Congress and I had children or
Mm,
grandchildren or dogs or all the above,
mm,
and I saw a film like ours and noticed all of these foundations that have been, making noise for so many years, then I would start to worry a little bit. What if this happens to my family or someone that I love? Maybe these people aren't crazy. Maybe there's something going on here. And the fact that it has been going on, the fact that a disease needs advocacy for 50 years, that alone should spark a congressional hearing. So I'm
absolutely.
hopeful. I think some people watch the film and they're like, it's not hopeful. And it's like, well, it's a hard situation. I don't think sugarcoating this helps anyone. That said, I think the fight, the fact that you're doing what you're doing, that we're doing what we're doing, everyone in the Lyme community that's doing their part, all of the patients who are just like getting through another day, like that's hopeful to me. I think it's actually incredible. It's incredibly hopeful. Julia in our film, Neil, for them to survive and thrive and want to help others despite everything that they're going through. I think the film is hopeful. I'm optimistic. If I weren't, I wouldn't be dedicating my life to this still. There's so many other things that I hope to birth in my lifetime creatively. Filmmaking and writing and all sorts of stuff. So it's, there's a reason that we're so dedicated to this. And I think it's because we feel that the tide is turning. We're close. We need to keep the pressure on. I think that's why statements like this from, our team regarding the CDC update, hopefully will inspire other people to do the same. We got to keep asking questions and demanding accountability.
Yeah. And actually, just to wrap up here, your film is very hopeful. Again, you do a tremendous job explaining the situation, why the history is. You track Dr. Specter and Julia and some others as well. But yeah, you can't leave watching the film saying, we're done, it's toast. I mean, it was very hopeful, because just people can now relate, right? I've met so many people who, when I started posting about Lyme, who said, oh, I have my sister-in-law's niece, right? And then I have people who were close to me. It's like, my there's been a Lyme outbreak at my kid's school or something like that, because of ticks. So it's getting more attention. We have actors like Chris Maloney, of course, who's been very public, with the Global Lyme Alliance, and more people. So once again, I want to thank Lindsay Keys. I just want to acknowledge you for the great work you've done and continue to do in getting the word out there. And I want to thank you. And once again, my name is Fred. Thank you. Once again, my name is Fred Diamond, and this is the Love, Hope, Lyme podcast.